Henika, welcome to BGS.
Thank you.
Or can I say welcome back?
Yeah. 3-4 years later.
I know. It's actually wild. Like you're our first returning guest, and I think that's been the intention for a while, is to kind of bring people back and kind of see where they are in their journey now and the stuff that they worked on. And I'm so honored that you're the first one. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, so much can happen in 4 years for this podcast, for anyone, I think, in anyone's life. So it's nice to actually take a moment to reflect on that as well.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Can we maybe start with a reintroduction?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Henika. I'm the founder of the School of Sensual Arts, and we share experiences for individuals and couples to connect more deeply, to express more freely, and to love more intimately. And we use the ancient Indian arts of Tantra, Yoga, Ayurveda with a blend of Western psychology to create these experiences and really talk about quite taboo subjects, not only in South Asian culture, but globally. And how do we bring those taboo subjects into conversation, into community where there is so much shame and repression around them. And yeah, that's a really big mission of mine. So I do a lot of myth busting around what Tantra is, because there's so much misunderstanding around it. And yeah, it's completely transformed my life. And just thinking back to that previous podcast that we recorded, I was just, I think, on the precipice of that big change happening. And so I back it still as much as I backed it, 4 years ago. And yeah, have since launched my book, Sensual. Yes. So it's not even been a year, and Sensual was published by Hay House. And you can find it all over the world, which is insane. But yeah, it really draws on these ancient philosophies and really helps us to organize them in a way that feels relatable to the modern day. So it's like yoga, tantra, ayurveda in application to the subject of sensuality, and really weaving in, like, how can I apply this to my daily life?
I think it's so interesting that someone in sort of our generation, I guess, in a big city like London and the modern day, and bringing these ancient practices back and trying to relate them back to our lives. I think we were talking about this just before we recorded, but there can be this like misconception that topics such as tantra or yoga or yoga, as people know it, or things like Ayurveda are, either you are super interested in that stuff and you've been learning that your whole life, or you live in the real world and you're not, you can't relate to that because it doesn't apply to us anymore. And I think there can be a real disconnect, and maybe like just some misconceptions of what these topics even mean, and how we translate them into the modern day. There's a huge conversation around yoga, right? And like how it's been adapted in the West, and also how we're now decolonizing yoga as well, and how we're becoming a lot more aware. But I find it fascinating that you're doing that work, because I'm sure it can't be easy. But through writing this book, I guess, what's maybe been a big revelation or learning about the community that has read your book and the way that they've perceived it? Like, have you been surprised by any of the feedback you've heard from the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's expanded like further and wider than I imagined. When I was writing it, I was thinking, having one person in mind, that if it was myself when I began my own journey, what words would I have needed from a place of feeling very numb, from a place of feeling very unfulfilled in my work, from a place of feeling like I'd lost my spark. And so, to be honest, anytime someone reads it and finds connection in any of the words, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And everyone finds connection to a different chapter, which I think is also really cool, depending on where they are in their own journey. I think I get a lot of messages from the South Asian community around like the book explaining a lot of the rituals that they would have seen growing up at home, but now there is a place for them and an explanation for them, because I too came from a background of law, like operating in my head, and was not connected to any of these. It's not like I've always been connected to these subjects, it was a learning for me as well. And so I can really relate to those people who are like, that's not for me. Like, I'm here, I'm doing my corporate thing, I'm in the Western world, I reject that part of my identity. Like, that was me. That was me. I was like, that's what I had to do to survive. And actually, when you start to go through the historical events that our communities have been through, and you start to look at actually decolonizing some of the thoughts that you think are normal, where have those thoughts come from? Okay. And then it's like, there's a deep reclamation of all the things that came before colonization as well. And you actually see that these are scientific methods. These are the Eastern sister sciences that have existed way longer than Western sciences. And Western science now supports Eastern science in studies. And we also have to think, who are those studies funded by, right? So a lot of people will say, well, if it's not supported by a study, then I don't believe it. But are you thinking about where or why this is being funded or, supported? And, I really believe that these practices, your body is the laboratory. It gives you personal power. So if you try a practice, it works for you, great, claim it. That's your power. If it doesn't work for you, fine, choose something else. It hasn't worked for you. No one's there like pressing you, do this, do that. And so, that was a complete tangent, but yeah, I get a lot of messages, I think, from South Asian community, just reflecting on things like that. And, my profile really grew a lot when I started talking about cultural appropriation, and a big mission of mine in the wellness world, in Tantra, in yoga, in Ayurveda, is to provide more cultural appreciation. So I've just kind of switched away from pointing fingers and have switched more towards providing education. So I think that's really the solution. And I don't think anyone wakes up any one day and is like, I'm going to completely pillage yoga or Tantra. That's like not a conscious thing that people do. It's unconscious. And so it's providing resources that can open the scope of these schools, sciences, so that they can be received by everyone, including the source origin people from where it comes.
That's quite interesting, because often when we talk about these topics, we're sort of gearing them towards the West, but actually it can also cater to people in the East. I loved what you said about the idea of kind of no longer pointing fingers, but actually trying to take it deeper and trying to understand where people's thought process is coming from. And I actually think as a society, maybe this is just me and my circle of friends, but I think there's a lot less pointing fingers generally, and there's a lot more of trying to actually understand, or maybe being aware that we might not have been exposed to these topics as authentically as we would like to. And maybe turning to teachers such as yourself to really try and understand that and bridge that gap between where we are today and what you're trying to teach, right? And maybe that gap between us now and our heritage and our ancestry, which I find really interesting, but it feels like a jump. So I'm actually quite looking forward to learning a bit more today from you about how we can actually start, embarking on that journey for ourselves and make it our own, without feeling like, like we talk about this like idea that it's a bit too woo-woo and it's, not for me type thing. Can it be for everyone? Because you said like sometimes it isn't for everybody, but do you, in your heart believe that people can adapt elements of these things no matter who they are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when my heart cries a little bit when I hear someone say, I went to one yoga class and it just wasn't for me. It's like saying I went to one music gig and it just wasn't for me, when there are a million amounts of music and musicians and styles and teachers and artists, and it's the same for the yogic practice. It's like there are different modalities that will suit you where you are in your life right now. And I had already sort of started on my yogic path, but there was still something missing for me, actually. And that's when I found Tantra. And Tantra was made in its origin for the everyday householder, like for people who have jobs, have relationships, have children, have sex, all of those things. Whereas the yogic path is made for the person who may relinquish their material connections to the world and focus on meditation and yoga and things like that. So actually I find deep acceptance and expansion in the tantric path. And for anyone who's listening who's like, what the hell is she talking about? Tantra, is it all about sex? She just mentioned sex. What is this? Well, Tantra is not only sex, and it's one of the things that has been cherry-picked into the West. But Tantra, just like yoga, is an entire lifestyle process. It's a philosophy. It is anything that brings expansion to your mind, your consciousness. It is the path of deep acceptance of oneself. And I think where in like religions and in spiritual paths, there's a lot of like, you should do this and you shouldn't do that. Actually, Tantra is like all embracing. It's like do everything consciously. And I find that really applicable to our generation, to this modern world where we are doing everything. So how can we bring more consciousness to that in a way that those things still serve us?
So is it a bit like mindfulness?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a bit of a thing with the word mindfulness because I do feel like it's another like Western adaptation of original Eastern methods, maybe packaged down and sold in a way. And I talk about it in the book, I call it sensefulness because it's less about filling your mind and watching your thoughts. And to me, it's more about going into your senses and your sensations and feeling the richness of the sensations and the senses. That's what brings you into the present moment. It's not watching your thoughts. It's like we have enough thoughts. We all have enough thoughts. So actually where we need to go is the body. Yeah. And our minds are so well trained. That's all we do in education. We train our minds. Yeah. So this whole, like the School of Sensual Arts is all about body wisdom, coming back into the body, learning things that we didn't learn in PE and sex education that can actually exponentially like transform the way that we experience ourselves and our intimacy and our purpose and our passions.
I want to take it back to your own story because I know, and I think we spoke about it very briefly in the previous episode we did, but you had a moment in your life where you felt numb in your body and you felt pretty much nothing, like in like intimate situations and stuff. I'd love to know what that feeling was, how you knew that there was something that needed to be done. And the reason I ask this is because I think maybe at times in my own life as well, I've not been very connected with my body sometimes. You're running around, you're busy, you're grabbing coffee, you're meeting friends, you're going to work, you're on your phone scrolling. Like we're actually disconnected sometimes without realizing there is a problem or that there is something to connect. And how would I then, take this like state of being, disconnected, I guess, in the modern world to then actually realize that, wait, there's something I need to do to not correct this, but to address this maybe?
Yeah, great question. I think numbness is such an interesting sensation because it's actually the absence of sensation. And so it takes even longer to realize that that is a sensation. Yeah. And that was such a pivotal moment, I think, in my own journey where it was like, you're feeling this way for a particular amount of time, but it's the absence of feeling. And once I realized that that is also a sensation, then I was able to take change in it. So if you're feeling like maybe symptoms of numbness, you could say are like feeling bored with things, like feeling like there's not joy, excitement, and not only positive emotions, but also not also feeling those big, real, raw emotions like anger and sadness and grief. And the reason why, after lots of study of this, I realized why numbness appeared for me in my body was because I had ignored those big emotions, particularly grief for me, and sensations for such a long time that my body had just turned the off button on them. Okay. And it was like, too big to look at this, need to carry on with regular life, got a job to go to, coffee to drink, friends to see. This has no place. It's way too big for me to handle right now and way too big for anyone else to handle. And so, yeah, it's sort of realizing that. And it's, it's a messy process. It doesn't look like a perfect downwards dog and a matcha tea. Like, these sciences are messy. They connect us to our messy parts of ourselves and give us processes that we can actually feel them and then regulate ourselves so that they're not overwhelming us or, becoming a part of our life that becomes muted. Mm-hmm. So I think translating that back to your question, really thinking about absence of sensation is important. And I think it's affecting more of us than we realize, like you said, because we have so many defenses within our hand's reach now that can help us to numb those sensations. Scrolling, like Netflixing, it's so much easier to wake up in the morning and pick up your phone than to wake up in the morning and think about how you feel going into that day, or to end the day and you're going to watch just one episode, and I'm so guilty of this too, then it turns into 3 and like that's it, that's the end of the day, and you haven't thought about how that day has felt or impacted you. Really, really easy arm's reach numbing substances are near us.
Well, I mean, there are more though, aren't there? There's drinking, there's taking like harder substances, there's also sex and porn and things like that. And it's quite interesting because I know we've spoken about how people perceive Tantra as just sex, but actually sex is such a big topic, that I think we're starting to talk about a bit more, which is good, like in the kind of mainstream context. But also I think that is also used as something to numb people, isn't it? And like also is like, I've read stats that people are having less sex as well, or like are less, I guess, enjoying it less. I don't know. So I think that's a huge, probably whole other topic in itself. But I'd love to hear your opinion a little bit more about how maybe that lack of sensation or that lack of connectedness that we're often feeling can then translate into maybe a lack of like quality in sex, and also a lack of pleasure in our lives, whether that's, physical sensations or even like in our own minds, like feeling pleasure in our head or joy, or, I guess maximizing what life has to offer. Because I actually think in this pursuit of just numbing everything all the time, we're actually like fractions of ourselves, aren't we? And it's quite a shame because we're just living like that without realizing we're wasting opportunities to live to the fullest.
Yeah, and I think it's opening our minds to that potential of what if this could be deeper? What if this could be more expansive? What if this could connect me even more to myself and my partner and my life? What if? And Tantra, really interestingly, it's sometimes also called a technology. And the way that it has existed since the 6th century and continued to exist is because, like a technology for the energetic world, it adapts to where that technology needs to be used at that time, which repressions are existing at that mode at that time. In the time of its conception, it was really helping to unrepress and to untangle some of the caste system that was happening. And, I mentioned it was for the everyday householder. The reason why it came out like that is because spiritual practices at that time were reserved for the holy caste, Brahmins, and also for men to share those teachings. And what Tantra did was turn that on its head and say, this is for the everyday householder. You don't need to belong to a certain caste. You can be a toilet cleaner, a street sweeper. It doesn't matter. This is for you. And it also placed goddesses at the figurehead of the practices. So it said, here are these natural embodiments of Shakti power. Let's change this, gender hierarchy and turn it on its head. And I think now what we're seeing in society, as you're saying, is this decline of birth rate. And it's not just about reproduction, it's about pleasure, it's about aliveness, it's about joy, it's about kama, which is what our ancient texts talked about. And think about this as a time pre-colonization when texts were created because making love was an art form. And, we study everything else, cooking, whatever your study of, your subject of study is. But why don't we study sex? Because it is one of the most powerful energies within the body. You don't have to study Tantra or even looked into this subject to understand the big hold that it can have in one's body. And so what can we do with this powerful energy? That's what Tantra became really, really interested in. And how can we create practices that help those who are interested in learning about love as an art form? How can we offer these practices that can help you to go deeper, help you to connect more, express more, feel more, be more? Because it's not just about what happens inside the bedroom. The bedroom is a mirror for everything else that happens in life. So it's like if you're having thoughts about expressing there, if it's difficult for you to say what you want, is it also difficult for you to say what you want in a boardroom? Is it also difficult for you to make yourself seen in that space? And so, we use the practices in tandem, and it's once you open the door to change in one area of your life, it's kind of impossible that it won't cascade into every other part. And I think that's how this technology works. It's finding those repressions that exist. And, we can't ignore the fact that we all came from sex. Yeah. So even on the spiritual path, and some spiritual paths will say, like, you can't do that if you're on the spiritual path. Whereas Tantra says, like, let's look at reality as it is. We didn't just magically appear here. So let's use this as a way of understanding ourselves better. And I think that, unfortunately, so many of us, and maybe people listening as well, have experienced some form of sexual abuse, or even just being feeling unsafe in your body throughout our lives because we've been over-sexualized. And actually, if we were taught tools on how to manage our own sexual energy at a younger stage, I really feel like there would be a lot less of that happening in the world. And so this isn't also just about having more fun and pleasure. It's about removing deep repressions that cause really life-changing impact in other people's lives that then become victims of that repression. So yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah.
And how would one say, I don't know, if, for example, someone's got a child that they're raising, how would they break that cycle of not teaching about sex properly? Because I still think, I'm not sure, I've been out of school for a very long time, but I know what I was taught in school, and I think your book talks about it as well, which is, you're taught how to put a condom on a cucumber, and you're taught about the things that could go wrong, if you don't use the right protection, then you'll get an STI, and it's all fear-based. And I think I found that very interesting, thinking about that, because that was my introduction to this world, was there's all this shameful stuff, so everyone's giggling in class, and now suddenly there's this thing I've never seen, which is being put on like a banana, and no one's really explaining what it is, apart from just, you could get some diseases. And I was just like, I don't understand, I'm not learning. And then obviously then there's a lifelong process of discovery on our own, and sometimes that's great, but other times I think if you're exposed to the wrong types of information, or information in the not the right sort of packaging at that young age, then you can live your whole life with the wrong sort of ideas. And it's a shame, really, because I think that's the norm for anyone who goes through the kind of schooling system in the West. But maybe it's changed now. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how that could be made better?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, say, let's play. Let's say instead of learning sex education, the subject was French. And the way that sex education is working, certainly when we learnt it, would have been, let me not teach you the language of French. Instead, let me tell you, if you were to speak French, you could catch this disease, this could go wrong, and this would happen. So be careful about speaking French. Here you go. That's your guide to French, right? And that's what it's like, because it's like there's no, it's like all the things that can go wrong. And so, okay, then you go into an experience and you're thinking about all the things that could go wrong and have no idea how to speak French and can't navigate that country, that culture, or that conversation at all. Like, that's what it's like. And so it's more about like going from the other side, I think. And, if you're a parent, then starting these conversations at a time, probably around the time like secondary school, I would say, when your hormones are starting to change, bodies are starting to change, talking about changes and feelings that might be happening, which are definitely not conversations that I had.
Same.
And I think a lot of people listening are probably not conversations that they had if you're, first generation, South Asian. Our parents were doing other stuff, working to survive in another country, weren't even sure about this subject for themselves, probably didn't receive any education themselves. Like, how are you going to change that? And I hope that in our generation we can. And like I said, I think the younger we start talking about this stuff, the better. I also think talking it's a conscious way of doing it. And actually the way that children learn and teenagers learn and everyone learns is actually more in an unconscious way. So it's about being the role model. So it's like, how are you with your body? Do you hide away your body? Is that teaching your child to hide away their body, that people shouldn't, see this? And that's fair enough. People shouldn't see some things. But I think those unconscious actions that we're taking, those are the ones that people are really picking up on as they grow up. And so I think personal power, like own self-healing, is probably also one of the greatest ways we can impart any knowledge to the next generation.
That example you gave of the French analogy, it just made me think of, have you watched Mean Girls?
Yeah, I love Mean Girls. I went to see the musical the other day.
Was it good?
It's fantastic.
Oh, it's on my list. But yeah, the Mean Girls movie, there's a scene where I think, is it like the PE teacher, and he's teaching them about sex, but he's writing chlamydia in the wrong letters.
Yeah,
he's spelling it wrong. He's like, don't have sex, you're gonna die or something. And I just love, that's literally what I thought of. And I was like, yeah, that's probably an extreme way of how we were taught it.
Yeah.
But I think talking about it from an early age is really good advice. And I think parents are doing that nowadays. I guess maybe my question would then be, like, if you were a teacher, say, how would it differ if you were teaching it in school? And I can't say because I don't know what the curriculums are like now. But I think it's better for kids these days, isn't it? They're a lot more aware, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more diversity as well, and acceptance of diversity, and it's not just cis het kind of talk that's shared. Like, there's a lot more fluidity within the way that it's shared, and that's obviously a massive advancement in the last 20 years that creates more inclusion rather than separation, which is really, really good. But teachers are everyday people. We can't expect teachers to also know everything. So I think just more education, as going back to that first conversation, more education in this for teachers, for people who are sharing sex education, for parents, for people who are young, all around is beneficial. Yeah.
Going back to the topic of sensuality as a whole, I'd actually love to know whether you've heard from any male readers, any kind of heterosexual, like cishet males, about these topics. And I don't know, are there any stories that you could share that have maybe stuck with you around that? Because I do feel like women often, you will see women talking about these things, but if I was to tell the men in my life about this, they'd probably most likely be like, oh, I've heard Tantra is about sex and that's it, or like don't know much about the topic or not interested either. I don't know. So have you had any experiences with men around this topic?
Yeah. I mean, School of Sensual Arts is for all. So it's not only for women. And I really wanted to keep it that way because there are lots and lots of spaces for women. And those are beautiful spaces that create safety and community. And there are not a lot of spaces for men. And there are not a lot of spaces for mixed gender spaces. And I think particularly when it comes to the realm of sensuality, sexuality, where a lot of our trauma can happen with the opposite gender, actually creating spaces with both genders or all genders is a great way to heal. And to find safety within those groups again. I actually received a message yesterday on Instagram from someone who said, me and my husband are exchanging gifts that like last Christmas, and instead of buying like books for ourselves, we're giving each other books that we think the other partner should read. And she had gifted her partner Sensual. Yes.
Okay.
And like that is music to my ears because I feel like, sensuality is not just a female aspect. It's sensuality exists in all beings. And Tantra really helps us to see beyond like male, female as well. And actually like one of the parts that is most repressed in men is the connection to their emotional selves, and that is Shakti, that is our sensuality, that is our sensations. So if this book can land, I know it has landed in the hands of men, then that's a beautiful thing because it helps us to understand each other more and ourselves more as well.
And I know I'm conscious that we have spoken about sort of men and women, but I also want to understand a bit more about whether you've had people from the queer community and, non-binary people, the trans community, who've come to your circles and felt like they were catered to, or they had something that they took out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like really, really proud of creating this space that is welcoming. And I really talk about Shakti as something that belongs to all people. And Shakti is our power. It is our like manifest body. It is our sensations. It is our sensuality. And the way that it is translated in the West is divine feminine, and it's such a mistranslation. And so actually retranslating it back to power, manifest energy, and then creating spaces where anyone in any body can explore Shakti and cultivate it for themselves. And I was very, very careful as well when I designed our tantric date nights and our experiences to use language that is inclusive, knowing that there will be all sorts of people, genders, ethnicities, ages, sexualities who are maybe even exploring what that is to them within these spaces. And there's a bit in the book about it as well, around like in ancient India and still today, there's this community of hijras, and how, once upon a time, hijras were giving such a highly elevated status in society. Hijras are, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, it's, you could say, the third gender, mixed gender, fluid gender. And this has long been a part of society. I think we're hearing about it now in this new way and thinking, oh, this must be a new wave, 20th century, 21st century thing. And it's not. It's existed for a long, long time in our lands. And it was given a lot of respect to be able to connect to both aspects or all aspects within oneself. And that, again, has changed over time in history. So
I want to touch on, I guess, a little bit about what spurred you on to write Sensual. What was the thought process when you were coming up with the idea? Did it kind of just fall into your lap, the idea, or walk me through the process of that and what it was like actually creating it?
Yeah, really good question. It was a bit of a reverse process for me because the publisher approached me. And so it wasn't like I was ready at that second with a proposal. It actually took me a few months of my own imposter syndrome coming up, working through my own shadows, submitting the proposal to actually get to the point where it came to be. But actually thinking about what it would be was very simple because I focus on one subject, School of Sensual Arts. So it's called Sensual. And it's so linked to my own journey. And so it's very, very natural for me to talk about it, research about it, write about it. Yeah. And so that's how it came around.
Did you face any inner demons when you were writing it?
Ooh, how long do we have? Because of course, I think it taught me so much about the creative process. And I think with the creative process, the messiness of the creative process that does involve procrastination, that is not linear, that brings up all of your shadows. Like when you're sitting there with a blinking cursor every single day and a blank page, it is your shadows that appear there first. And, allowing space for that to process at the same time as creativity I think it's part of it. And I think for creatives, creative minds, anyone is creative. But there's this thing where, like, if we're not making progress in it, then we're bad creatives, or, but it just doesn't work like that. It's like, it's all part of the process, like all the resistance, all the shadows. It's like one of the greatest vehicles, I think, for self-revelation, whatever your creative passion is. Yeah. And so definitely imposter syndrome, and working through that and what it meant. And I feel like I wrote the book 3 times. The first version of the book was purely like, well, it was just for myself, really. It was remembering why I'd come to these practices, who was that girl, and she felt really numb, like overwhelmed with grief, lacking fulfillment. I had to sit with her again for a really long time. And that was really hard. And then the second time I wrote it, I flipped back to my law brain, and it almost became a textbook. It was like philosophy, psychology, practices. Frameworks, exactly. And then actually the third version or iteration of the book became combining these 2 things and making a piece of work that was relatable, had heart in it, had vulnerability in it, had story in it, and also had frameworks and philosophy and psychology that's then applicable to people who are reading it. So yeah, lots of pinging backwards and forth with the way that it manifested. Yeah.
Did you have someone actually like reviewing it and kind of making you rewrite it as well in the background?
Yeah. I worked with an editor from my publisher, Hay House, all along the way. Kezia, shout out to Kezia, she's amazing. And it's, I went to a book launch earlier this week, actually, someone else's book launch, and actually just took a moment to congratulate the editor, because they are the people that you don't see behind the whole process that help you to navigate it and shape the book into what it becomes. I think sometimes, when you read a piece of writing so many times, you can't even see it anymore. It's really easy to get to that stage with any creative work. So just having that second pair of eyes that is really there for your highest good. It's not, it was always very constructive for me. I was really lucky. And also very open to the feedback as well.
You have to be.
So it did take over my life for a few years, though.
I can imagine. And congratulations on it. And
Thank
it's
you.
such a feat, I think. Not easy at all. But I actually, obviously, I'm quite conscious that for you, the book is a medium. It's about the messaging behind that book, right? That you're trying to circulate out even further, or in a slightly different way. What intentions or hopes do you have for the messages that you've included in this book for the world, I guess, for our South Asian community, but also other communities and people who may be on their journey of, self-discovery, or are actually not very close to it at all, but may be curious about learning about it?
My message is always, I hope that the book helps you to remember your own inner power. And it is a path of reclaiming one's inner power. That is Shakti, that is power. So I hope it lands in the hands of anyone who is, on that journey of just remembering, like coming back to how powerful we can really be when we connect to ourselves, when we think about what we really want in our lives, when we like pick up the mirror to some of the really difficult parts within ourselves. And actually, one of the processes in Tantra is the process of transmutation. So it's where you take one substance and transform it into another. I mean, it exists in science as well. And so it's really interested in the difficult experiences that you've had. How can that substance be transformed into personal power? And I think once you make that switch, it becomes a very, very, rather than something difficult that's happened to you that is very, very like overwhelming or difficult to face. And actually you see like, okay, maybe I'm not happy that this thing has happened to me and I didn't get a choice in it, but I do get a choice with how it gets weaved into my life and how much possession it has over me and what I make with it. And they often say, like, once you embark on the tantric path, your creativity like multifolds, because it is also your creative energy as well. And if you take all your pain and it becomes substance for creativity, I mean, most songs are about pain, why is that? Mm-hmm. It's transmutation, it's expression, it's creativity. And it resonates with so many of us that are listening to those songs or those rhythms.
Is there ever a point where we've made it in our journey? Like, or is it a lifelong learning? I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, I think it's the second one. Like, it's a lifelong journey. And I do feel like the more you learn, almost like the less you know. And then it's sort of,
oh gosh,
you just sort of keep going, really. And I'm not saying that in a way that's like negative. It's more, I guess, just becoming aware of the things that exist, and then acting in your life from that place of awareness. Like I'm always very wary of things that say like this will heal you, as if it's like one thing that you have to do and then you'll be healed, because it's not.
Like 5 ways in which you can heal your entire life.
yeah it's like in 3 days or something. And yeah, actually it's just going through life and gathering more tools that can support us.
And on a practical level, how has your journey actually helped you in your day-to-day? Like, how has it helped you cope with moments where you felt stressed or anxious or misunderstood, or you may have had an argument with somebody and you're overthinking it? Like, how do you come back to a place of grounding using these techniques and practices?
It's given me a lot of tools, like tools that I would never have come across ever if I hadn't, embarked on these journeys. And let's say, for example, difficult conversations, like that is something I was not well versed in. I didn't grow up in a family that had deep and meaningful conversations about difficult things. It was like very, let's get on with it. Like, let's get to life. Let's, go to school, do your business, all that stuff. And actually that part of having vulnerable conversations, difficult conversations, was very missing for me. And there was a technique that I came across called NVC, nonviolent communication, which it isn't a part of Tantra, but it's very tantric in its approach. And it helps you to have conversations that are really difficult. It's a 4-part process. And that does sound quite like rigid when you first come to it, but I implement it in my own relationship, in my marriage, and it's become a much more natural process to have difficult conversations, which actually can only bring more intimacy in the end. And yeah, I think it's very, very practical. There's also great ways to like ground and down regulate through the practices, which I think is something that everyone needs all the time, because there's so much that can over regulate us and just send us into feelings of anxiety or stress. And so if I am going into that, maybe I'll just take a moment to like shake my body. That's like my favorite practice ever, I think, and I share it a lot at the School of Sensual Arts. It's incredible. All mammals do it, but we've just forgotten or stopped doing it.
Wow.
And it's such an incredible way to just allow the natural intelligence of your body to process what might be coming up and to reduce your cortisol levels. 2-3 minutes and you're like a completely different person.
Mm.
Or just get on the ground. Like the ground is really big, and it can transmute, it can take all of those big feelings that are there that you feel like you can't put anywhere. Just lay down. Give it to the ground, lay down, listen to some music. Yeah. Like if you're in your head, I think just go to the polar opposite.
Yeah. Actually, I find that so relatable for my life, because when I was in COVID, I was living in a very, very small space on my own, like literally 200 square foot. It was wild. And I remember discovering, I think, in my agony of like being on my own constantly every single day and like, seeing the same four walls, I realized that going for a shower helped me a lot, because it was like the feeling of the water on my skin. Or like people go outside obviously to get some air or to look at some trees or whatever it is, just to kind of get a slightly different like change of environment. So even like grounding yourself, like you say, barefoot, just standing on the ground or in the grass maybe, or lying down, it's just like changing your state, isn't it? And I think for me, changing my state really works. So yeah, I'm glad that I've kind of accidentally figured out ways to manage breathing. Actually, breath work helped me a lot as well. And I know you've talked about breath work a bit in your book as well. What's like a simple way that somebody could just calm themselves down in a situation using whatever they have? Like maybe they're on the tube and they don't want to shake around.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a practice that's 4-7-8 breath, and it is now science-backed, but it comes from pranayama. Prana is energy and yama is control. So it's a tool that can help you to bring control to your energy, and anxiety, stress, they're all manifestations of heightened energy within the body. So 4-7-8 is the amount of seconds. So you inhale for 4, you hold your breath for 7, and you exhale like you're blowing air out of a straw through your mouth for 8. And that specific amount of seconds of inhaling, holding, and exhaling has been proven to have an incredible effect at switching your nervous system from overdrive into downregulation. And you only need to do it 4 times for it to have an effect. So it's a very quick thing. And I use it whenever I'm feeling nervous. It's incredible. It's like an emergency handbrake. So it's a great thing to have in your back pocket. And again, personal power in that. You don't have to take something or go somewhere and pay for someone to do it. Like, you have that personal power to shift the way that you may be feeling. And it can be in as little as a minute.
Yeah, it's such a life hack, isn't it? I used to do it and I've forgotten that I've got it at my disposal, so I might start again actually. You mentioned that you're married, and I'm super excited to, I guess, learn a bit more about what it's like, shifting into this new phase of life as someone also who teaches about topics that that are very kind of, I guess, can feel very different when you put them into the context of someone who's being married, particularly as a South Asian woman. I think there's a lot of preconceptions around, how sensual you can be or how open you can be with yourself and your body. You're married, you need to pipe down, I know these are really old school kind of things, and I'm sure a lot of people don't think like that anymore, but how is this kind of shift maybe like transform the way that you do your work?
It's such a good question. I think when I was a kid growing up in my dad's newsagents, and I was reading Sneak magazine and reading the Agony Aunts, and I was like, I just wish there was a column for brown girls that said, like, but do brown girls have sex before marriage? And these kind of questions. And so that really informs my work. Like, I want to be that agony aunt that provides those answers for all ages, actually. I think, in marriage, for me as well, even studying these subjects, it still brought up that whole thing of like, what does it mean to be a wife? What does it mean to be a daughter-in-law? What does it mean to be an in-law? Like, there's so much pressure, I think, around what it means to go into marriage, almost more, I think, than what it means to go into your job or things like that. There's this huge weight, like your family have been waiting their whole life for you to get married. So, okay, here you go. You're like, woo, okay, there's no guidebook for this. And so, yeah, it's sort of figuring that out as you get there. And the practices do really help, to be honest. And I think my partner is not in this world. So for me, it's like an invitation to share something. And I think earlier on in our relationship, before we were married, I'd learn a new technique or something and I'd go, we have to try this. And it would almost be like a guinea pig to try it with. And actually, like, I had to learn to sort of separate work from the relationship. But as time has gone on and actually finding ways to choose practices to do together has been incredible. Like, it's been really, really cool. And yeah, just figuring out the wifey stuff as I go along. Yeah.
Has anything come up for you since you've gotten married, in terms of like maybe any preconceived notions you had about what it would be like when you get married versus now that you're in it? Are there any surprises?
Yeah, I think also thinking about, I'm in an interracial marriage. So I came in with the idea that all parents are the same kind of thing and all families are the same. And what's been really interesting in going into another family is that you actually learn that different families operate in another way. And I know that sounds really obvious, but actually it wasn't obvious for me until I got there. And I thought, wow, this is really different. Love is shown in a really different way. I'm experiencing a different kind of affection that I've never experienced before. And actually a lot of the fears that I had around, in-law dynamics, they were just fears in the end. And there's been great like relief on the other side. And I know that's not true for everyone. In everyone's experience, it can be completely the other way. But yeah, it's understanding that there are different dynamics other than your own. And yeah, learning what those are.
Yeah, adapting, right, to the changes, I guess. That's super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. And I feel like so much of this is very practical and will probably give me a lot of food of thought when I go back and re-listen to it. But also hopefully anyone who's listening will hear something that, will help cope with maybe something they need coping with. I guess the last question that I ask everybody, and this is the second time I'm asking you this, Henika, is what do you have strong game in?
Ooh, good question. I have strong game in like optimism. Like I'm deeply optimistic about things. And I used to be naively optimistic about things. But now I feel like my optimism is more rooted in reality. And it's something that I've heard people say. So I'm going to go with that one.
Wow. It takes a lot, I think, to think in that way. We're not built as humans to always be optimistic, and we tend to focus a lot on negative things. So it's great to hear that. And thank you so much for all the work that you do, for this book, for existing and being a light, and for sharing your message, because I think it can't be said enough and it can't be shared enough. So I look forward to the next books you're going to write. I look forward to the events you're going to run, and I really hope that more people find out about your amazing work.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, me again. Just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of Brown Game Strong. I hope you enjoyed it and got something useful out of it. If you'd like to stick around, then please hit subscribe if you're listening on YouTube. And if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can click follow to get updated on all of the latest episodes. It helps me immensely in continuing to bring you more exciting guests and interesting stories so that we can continue to learn about all the awesome work that's happening in our community. Thank you for your support. It never goes unnoticed, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.